My name is Megan Sutton. I was 42 years old when my sister tried to claim the son she abandoned 19 years ago. Her boyfriend died in a car crash. My mother panicked. She said a scandal would ruin our reputation, ruin Victoria's future, ruin everything. So, they turned to me. I was 23, broke, and had never held a newborn in my life. I took him anyway, raised him alone, worked double shifts to buy his asthma inhalers, dropped out of architecture school, and sat in every emergency room by myself. My sister moved to Colorado, started failed tech companies, burned through secret money, and never once picked up the phone to ask about his breathing. Then he won a prestigious architectural scholarship, and my sister walked into that mayor's gala carrying a Cartier. Congratulations from your real mom. What happened at that civic dinner exposed a massive fraud, made my sister's investor walk out, and made 400 powerful people watch a financial empire crumble to the ground. Before we start, if you appreciate stories about hidden sacrifices, exposed lies, and the real meaning of foundations, take a second to like and subscribe. Drop a comment and tell me where you are right now and what time it is. Let me take you back 20 years to the night my phone buzzed against my drafting board at 4:15 in the morning. I grew up in Maple Ridge, Michigan. It is the kind of town where the bank teller knows your checking balance by heart, and the local mechanic knows exactly when your transmission is going to fail. My sister Victoria was the family's center of gravity. She was a painter, delicate, emotional, and always on the verge of some new heartbreak. Our mother, Rachel, bought her $75 sable paintbrushes while I taped my broken T-square together. I was an architecture student in my final year. I was the foundation, the one who fixed the leaky sink, balanced the checkbook, and stayed up late building scale models. Our father, Gordon, had run a small lumber yard into the ground. He owed the bank $92,000. That debt hung over our house like black smoke. Rachel was terrified of losing her status. She covered her panic by pushing Victoria toward Trent Barnes, the son of a wealthy local hotel owner. Trent was reckless, rich, and drove a sports car. Rachel looked the other way because Trent's last name meant safety. Then came that Wednesday in November. The call at 4:15 a.m. was not from my mother. It was a triage nurse at Grace Hospital. Trent's car had hit a concrete median on Highway 7 at 90 miles an hour. I walked into the emergency room 30 minutes later. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The floor smelled like industrial bleach and spilled coffee. Gordon was staring blankly at a vending machine. Rachel was pacing near the front desk. Trent was dead. Victoria was sedated in room 305 with a fractured collarbone, and the trauma doctors had found something else during her scan. A heartbeat. She was 17 weeks pregnant. Before the sun even came up, a man in a $3,000 suit arrived. He was a lawyer for the Barnes family. They were grieving, but they were also terrified of a public scandal. A dead heir and an illegitimate child in a small town was bad for their corporate image. The lawyer offered Rachel a quiet, ironclad deal. A $300,000 trust fund would be set up for the child. Rachel would receive a hefty monthly maintenance allowance to cover expenses. The only conditions: the child had to be raised quietly in Maple Ridge, and Trent's name could never be on the birth certificate. Rachel pulled me into the freezing concrete stairwell of the hospital. Her eyes were hard. She did not cry for Trent. She did not cry for Victoria. "The bank forecloses on our house on the 18th, Megan," she said. Her voice echoed off the cinder blocks. "I am signing the paperwork. The monthly allowance will save the house. It will save my bakery." "Who is going to raise a baby?" I asked. "You are," she said. "Victoria is traumatized. She can't even look at a car right now. I'm sending her to a recovery clinic in Colorado. We have nothing. If you do not raise this child, we are all out on the street." She didn't ask. She handed me the anchor and told me to swim. The only person in the family who had ever supported my career was my great-aunt Evelyn, but she lived 4 states away. I was on my own. A nurse pushed open the stairwell door. She handed me a clear plastic belongings bag. Inside was a heavy, crushed silver compass. Trent used to carry it everywhere. There was dried blood on the glass. I did not go back to the university that morning. I drove to the registrar's office and dropped out of my final year. I put my architectural models in the dumpster behind my apartment. That afternoon, I walked into a small, dusty local drafting firm and took a job drawing floor plans for exactly $21.50 an hour. 6 months later, I stood in a freezing delivery room. The birth was chaos. Victoria was panicking. The monitors were beeping frantically. She was screaming, fighting the nurses, trapped in the memory of the car crash. When Declan was finally born, the nurse wiped him down and tried to place him on Victoria's chest. Victoria took one look at him. He had Trent's exact jawline, Trent's dark hair. She screamed, violently pushing herself backward against the hospital bed headboard, covering her face with her hands. "Get him away, please, get him away from me." The nurse froze. The room went entirely still except for the baby crying. I stepped forward. I took the baby from the nurse's arms. I felt his tiny heart beating against my ribs. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out that dented silver compass, and placed it gently on the edge of his plastic bassinet. 4 days later, I drove Victoria to the airport. She didn't have a suitcase, just a designer carry-on Rachel had bought her to feel better. She didn't look back at the car where Declan was strapped into a second-hand car seat. She didn't ask how I was going to pay for his first round of shots. She just boarded a plane for Colorado and disappeared into a life of healing that didn't include 5 a.m. feedings. I moved back into my parents' house, but not into my old room. Rachel had turned that into a guest space for her bakery clients. I was in the basement, next to the furnace that rattled every time it kicked on. The first winter was a nightmare. Declan didn't just have a cough. He had lungs that sounded like they were full of wet gravel. The diagnosis came on a Wednesday at 10:20 p.m. in a crowded urgent care clinic: chronic asthma. "The inhalers are expensive," the doctor said, scribbling on a pad. "And the nebulizer treatments aren't fully covered by basic insurance." I went to the pharmacy counter. One specialized inhaler was $168.40. My bank account had $175 in it, and I still needed gas to get to work for the rest of the week. I went to the kitchen that night where Rachel was counting the cash from the bakery's weekend sales. She was wearing a new wool coat. The house was warm, the mortgage was paid, and the lumberyard debt was shrinking thanks to the allowance she was taking from Declan's trust. "Mom, I need $160, I said, holding the prescription. "Declan can't breathe. He's turning blue when he coughs." Rachel didn't even look up from the stacks of 20s. "Things are tight, Megan. The oven in the shop needs a new heating element. You're working, aren't you? Figure it out." I didn't argue. I went back to the basement. I stopped eating lunch. I skipped breakfast. For 4 weeks I lived on black coffee and the crusts of Declan's toast so I could afford the silver canisters that kept his lungs open. My boss at the drafting firm, Mr. Harrison, was a quiet man who wore flannel shirts and smelled like sawdust. He noticed I was losing weight. He noticed the dark circles under my eyes. On a Thursday afternoon at 4:58 p.m., he walked over to my desk. "You're doing the work of a junior architect, Megan," he said, dropping a folder on my desk. "I'm giving you a raise to $28 an hour and full benefits. You're the only one in this office who actually knows how to read a structural load." That insurance saved us. It paid for the nebulizer. It paid for the specialist visits. 6 years passed in a blur of blue blueprints and hospital corridors. Victoria called every 7 months. She never asked about Declan's breathing. She talked about her creative energy and the tech startups she was trying to launch in Boulder with money Rachel was secretly wiring her. When Declan was 7, he sat on the floor of my basement room, surrounded by my old architecture textbooks. He wasn't playing with trucks. He was drawing straight lines with my old scale ruler. "Mom?" he asked. I stopped typing on my laptop. "Yeah, buddy? Why does Grandma tell the neighbors I'm her nephew?" My heart felt like it was being squeezed by a cold hand. "Grandma is complicated, Declan." "You aren't," he said, standing up and leaning his head against my shoulder. "You're just home." The betrayal didn't come all at once. It leaked out in small moments, like when I found a crumpled receipt in the trash for a $5,000 wire transfer to a V. Sutton, in Colorado, dated the same day Declan had been hospitalized for a severe asthma attack, and Rachel told me she couldn't help with the $600 deductible. Then, 3 weeks before Christmas, the phone rang. It wasn't Victoria. It was my great-aunt Evelyn. She was moving back to Maple Ridge after her husband passed away. She was a retired family court judge, sharp as a razor and twice as tough. "I'm coming home, Megan," she said over the phone. "And I think it's time someone looked into why your mother's bakery is doing so well while you're still driving a car with a taped-up bumper." Victoria decided to come home for Christmas too. She arrived in a rented Porsche, wearing oversized sunglasses, acting like she had just returned from a war zone instead of a failed startup. At the dinner table, the air was thick with the smell of roast beef and lies. Victoria kept reaching across the table to pat Declan's hand. "My sweet boy," she would say, her voice high and fake. "You have your mother's eyes." Declan, now 16 and taller than me, pulled his hand away. He looked at me, then at her. "Which mother, Victoria? The one who faxes birthday cards or the one who sits in the ER until 5 a.m.? The room went dead silent. Rachel dropped her fork. It clattered against the china, a sharp, ugly sound. "Don't be disrespectful," Rachel hissed. Victoria has been through trauma you couldn't understand." "I understand numbers," Declan said quietly. He didn't say anything else. But that night, after everyone was asleep, I found him in the kitchen. He wasn't eating, he was staring at an open laptop on the counter. "Mom," he whispered, "look at this." He hadn't found a diary, he hadn't overheard a phone call. He had been helping Aunt Evelyn set up her new wireless printer, and he'd stumbled across a shared cloud folder Evelyn had been using to organize her old legal files. There was an email from the Barnes family lawyer. It was dated 7 months ago. Per our agreement with Rachel Sutton, the final principal of the $300,000 trust will be released upon Declan's 19th birthday. However, as the biological mother, Victoria Sutton has requested an early hardship withdrawal of $125,000 to cover business liabilities. We require a signature from the legal guardian to authorize this. I looked at the next file. It was a digital scan of a signature. It was my name, Megan Sutton, but I had never seen that document in my life. The cursor blinked on the bright screen. I stared at the digital loop of the M in my name. It was my signature, but it was slightly rigid. It looked exactly like the signature on my old 2009 tax returns, which I kept in a filing cabinet in Rachel's home office. Declan's breathing was a little heavy next to me. He leaned against the granite counter, waiting. "Did you sign that, Mom?" he asked. His voice was low. He already knew the answer. "No," I said. My chest felt hollow. It was a physical ache, right behind my ribs. I didn't scream. I didn't march upstairs and kick open my mother's bedroom door. Anger is a luxury you cannot afford when you are the only wall standing between your son and a collapsing roof. I clicked the print icon. The wireless Canon printer in Aunt Evelyn's guest room down the hall whirred to life. I closed the laptop. I looked at my 16-year-old son. He was wearing a faded gray sweatshirt. He had spent his childhood in emergency rooms, terrified he wouldn't be able to draw his next breath, while the 2 women sleeping upstairs committed wire fraud to fund a failing app in Boulder. "Go to bed, buddy," I told him, smoothing a hand over his dark hair. "I am going to handle this." At 6:30 the next morning, I walked 3 blocks down Oak Street to Aunt Evelyn's new house. It smelled like peppermint tea and unpacking boxes. Evelyn was sitting at her small dining table, reading the local newspaper. She wore a thick cardigan and her reading glasses were perched on the end of her nose. I set the 4 printed pages on top of her crossword puzzle. Evelyn picked them up. She read the email. Then she looked closely at the signature. As a former family court judge, she had spent 30 years looking at liars. She didn't gasp. She just took off her glasses and placed them on the table. "Your mother traced this," Evelyn said, her voice entirely flat. "This is federal wire fraud, Megan. If this withdrawal goes through, Rachel and Victoria are looking at prison time." I sat down in the wooden chair across from her. I thought about the days I ate leftover crusts. I thought about the $168 inhalers. The favoritism had always been there. Rachel had always treated me like a pack mule and Victoria like a fragile glass doll. But this was different. This wasn't just unfair. It was theft. They were stealing the compensation for Trent's death. They were stealing Declan's safety net. "I don't want them in prison," I said, staring at my cracked fingernails. "I just want the money locked down, all of it. Declan is turning 17 soon. He wants to go to architecture school. That fund is his." Evelyn nodded slowly. "I still have friends at the probate court. I will file an emergency injunction this morning. We will freeze the trust completely, pending a routine guardianship audit. The bank will lock the account. Rachel won't be able to access the monthly allowance, and Victoria's $125,000 withdrawal will bounce hard. They won't know we initiated it. They will just think the bank flagged the account." "Do it," I said. 3 days later, the fallout hit the house. I was at the kitchen sink washing dishes when Rachel burst through the back door. Her face was flushed red. She threw her leather purse onto the table. She grabbed the landline phone and started dialing the bank's customer service line. "What do you mean my accounts are frozen?" she yelled into the receiver a minute later. "I have a bakery to run. I have vendors to pay." She paced the kitchen floor, her heels clicking aggressively against the linoleum. I kept scrubbing a frying pan. The water was warm. For the first time in 16 years, my shoulders felt light. Victoria's reaction was entirely different. She came down the stairs an hour later, holding her cell phone like it had burned her. Her face was pale. Without the $125,000 injection, her tech startup's servers were being shut down. The investors were pulling out. She walked over to where I was drying my hands on a towel. She looked panicked, completely stripped of her usual glossy confidence. "Megan," she said, her voice shaking, "do you have any money saved, like in an emergency fund?" I looked at her. I thought about the $15 toy truck she sent for Declan's 8th birthday. No, Victoria, I said quietly, folding the dish towel. Things are very tight right now. You're smart though, figure it out. I used her exact words, the ones she and Rachel had used on me for over a decade. Victoria stared at me, her mouth slightly open, completely unable to process the word no. The trust freeze starved them out. Victoria had to return her rented Porsche. She packed her designer bags and flew back to Colorado on a budget airline, crying about how unfair the universe was to creative people. Rachel had to sell her commercial bakery oven to cover her debts. She complained to the neighbors about how the banking system was rigged against hard-working small business owners. I didn't say a word, I just kept going to work. Over the next 3 years, Declan grew into a quiet, intensely focused young man. By the time he was a college freshman, he was sketching detailed blueprints at my drafting table. His asthma was under control, but he never forgot the fear of those late-night hospital runs. When the town announced the mayor's architectural competition to design a new municipal building, Declan didn't draw a library or a fire station. He drew a state-of-the-art community center with specialized air filtration systems, designed specifically for children with chronic respiratory issues. He worked on it every night until 2 a.m. I bought him fresh graphite pencils on Thursdays. We were a team. In late March, 4 weeks before Declan's 19th birthday, an envelope arrived in the mail. It was thick, creamy parchment paper with the mayor's seal embossed on the flap. Declan opened it at the kitchen table. He read the letter twice, his eyes moving rapidly over the text. Then he looked up at me. He handed the thick parchment across the table. His thumb was pressing so hard into the paper that his knuckle was white. I read the embossed print. First place, the mayor's architectural scholarship. Award amount, $20,000. To be presented at the annual Maple Ridge Civic Gala on June 12th. I didn't cheer. I didn't jump up and down. I just traced the gold foil seal with my index finger. I looked at the dark circles under his eyes, the graphite smudges on his left palm, and I felt a fierce, physical heat in my chest. They saw it, I said quietly. They saw how hard you worked. We worked, Declan corrected. He tapped the edge of the kitchen table. You bought the drafting vellum. You stayed up to check my math on the HVAC loads. News travels through Maple Ridge faster than a brush fire. By Wednesday, Declan's picture was on the front page of the local Sentinel. The headline read, "Local teen designs breath of fresh air for community." Suddenly my mother remembered she had a grandson. Rachel had spent the last 3 years bitter and complaining, barely scraping by after Aunt Evelyn froze the trust. But the moment she saw Declan's face in the paper, her whole posture changed. I walked into the kitchen on a Friday evening and found her clipping the newspaper article with her sewing scissors. "The mayor's gala is $250 a plate dinner, Megan," she said, carefully placing the clipping into a clear plastic binder. "The entire city council will be there. The developers. The investors." She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at a lifeline. Declan was turning 19 in exactly 4 weeks. The trust fund, if she could somehow get Victoria to claim it, would unlock. And now Declan wasn't just a sick kid she had ignored. He was a local celebrity. He was a valuable asset. 3 days later, a sleek black Cadillac Escalade pulled into our cracked driveway. I was on the front porch, shaking out a rug, when Victoria stepped out of the back seat. She looked thinner. Her clothes were still designer, but they looked a season old. A man stepped out after her. He wore a sharp, tailored charcoal suit and rimless glasses. He looked at our peeling porch paint with mild disgust. Victoria walked up the steps, plastering on a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Megan," she said, air kissing near my cheek. "This is Aaron Sinclair. He's the primary backer for my new venture. I told him all about my brilliant son." I held the dusty rug in my hands. I looked at Mr. Sinclair. He gave a curt nod. Victoria's tech startup was dead. I knew that. Aunt Evelyn knew that. But Mr. Sinclair clearly didn't know the whole truth yet. Victoria had brought him to Maple Ridge to put on a show. She needed him to see her as a devoted mother who was about to come into a massive $300,000 family trust fund. If she could convince Sinclair she had access to that capital, he wouldn't pull his remaining investments or sue her for fraud. "Declan is at the library," I said flatly. "That's fine," Victoria said, waving her hand dismissively. "We're staying at the Hilton on Highway 7. We will see him at the gala." She walked into the house to find Rachel. Mr. Sinclair followed. That night, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter at 9:15 p.m. I was wiping down the stove. Declan was sitting at the table, eating a bowl of cereal. He looked down at his own phone, which had buzzed at the exact same time. It was a text from Victoria. She had created a group chat with just the two of us. My sweet boy. I am so proud of you. I have finally come out of my trauma. The darkness is gone. I have an apartment in Colorado with a second bedroom just for you. We can finally live like a real family, Mr. Sinclair has incredible connections for architecture school. Declan read the message. He didn't sigh. He didn't look angry. He just looked tired, the way you look when a telemarketer calls for the 4th time during dinner. I watched his thumbs move over the glass screen. He typed a single sentence. He hit send. My phone buzzed again as the reply came through the group chat. My home is in Michigan. He turned his phone face down on the table, picked up his spoon, and went back to eating his cereal. The morning of the mayor's scholarship gala, the house was tense. Rachel had been up since 6 a.m., pacing the hallways, steaming a silk dress she couldn't afford. I didn't buy a new dress. I went to the back of my closet and pulled out the same navy blue blazer and slacks I wore to my job interviews. I had dropped them off at the dry cleaner on Oak Street the day before. The $5.99 yellow paper tag was still stapled to the lapel. I pulled it off and tossed it in the trash. Declan came out of his room wearing a rented black suit. It fit him perfectly. He stood in the hallway mirror, adjusting his tie. I walked up behind him and smoothed the fabric on his shoulder. You look good, buddy. He reached into his pocket. He pulled out the heavy, scratched silver compass. The glass was still cracked from the car accident 20 years ago. He ran his thumb over the metal casing, then slid it into the inside breast pocket of his suit jacket, right over his heart. He met my eyes in the mirror. He gave a small, solid nod. We didn't ride with Rachel. We took my old Toyota. The engine sputtered a bit at the stoplights, but it got us to the Maple Ridge Town Hall. The parking lot was full of Audis and Lexus. The entrance was lined with string lights and local reporters holding cameras. Inside, the grand ballroom smelled like expensive catered salmon and heavy perfume. There were over 400 people finding their seats at round tables covered in white linens. Aunt Evelyn was already there. She sat at table 6, wearing a sharp tweed suit, looking like a hawk watching a field of mice. Victoria and Mr. Sinclair were seated in the absolute front row, right next to the mayor's podium. Victoria was leaning into Mr. Sinclair, whispering something and pointing toward the stage. Rachel was sitting next to them, and in Rachel's lap, resting on a velvet jeweler's cushion, was a heavy silver Cartier box. I stared at that dark green velvet box. I knew exactly what it was. A prop. A shiny, expensive piece of metal, bought with the trust fund's monthly allowance before Aunt Evelyn froze the accounts. Rachel had hoarded that money for years, letting me skip meals to buy asthma medication, and now she was using the leftover dregs to buy a Cartier. Before we could even reach our table, Victoria intercepted us. She blocked our path near the ice sculpture. Mr. Sinclair stood 2 steps behind her, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water. Victoria reached out and brushed a piece of imaginary lint from Declan's lapel. You look so handsome, she said loudly. A photographer from the Sentinel was standing 10 feet away. Victoria made sure she was angled perfectly for the lens. She turned to me. Her voice dropped a fraction, but the fake sweetness remained. You did a good job, Megan. You really fulfilled the duty of a decent caretaker. But a boy heading to a top-tier architecture school needs more than a drafting desk in a basement. He needs his real mother. He needs actual resources. She gestured slightly toward Mr. Sinclair. My investors are prepared to fully support him. We are going to make sure he has the life he deserves. I looked at her emerald earrings. I looked at the slight tremor in her hands. She was terrified. If she didn't publicly claim Declan tonight, if she didn't get that trust fund unlocked at midnight, Sinclair would ruin her. I didn't yell. I didn't point out that she hadn't paid for a single copay in 19 years. I just smiled. A small, tight, close-lipped smile. Take your seat, Victoria, I said quietly. The program is starting. She blinked, unsettled by the silence, but retreated to the front row. Declan and I sat at table 14, near the back. For the next hour, the room filled with the clatter of silverware against porcelain, and the low hum of wealthy networking. I drank tap water. Declan didn't touch his roasted chicken. He kept his right hand inside his suit jacket, his fingers resting against the silver compass. At exactly 7:45 p.m., the lights dimmed, the chatter faded. Mayor Hopkins, a heavy-set man with a booming voice, stepped up to the acrylic podium. Tonight, we are here to honor the future of Maple Ridge, the mayor announced, adjusting his microphone. We asked our youth to design a space that heals. One young man looked at his own struggles, and instead of complaining, he drafted a masterpiece. The crowd applauded. I kept my hands folded in my lap. Please welcome the winner of the $20,000 Civic Scholarship, Mr. Declan Sutton. The applause swelled. Declan stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He walked down the center aisle with the steady, measured pace of a man twice his age. He climbed the 4 steps to the stage and shook the mayor's hand. That was Rachel's cue. She stood up from the front row. She didn't have a microphone, but she had the velvet box. She walked directly to the edge of the stage, holding it out like an offering. The lid was popped open. Inside, a heavy silver watch gleamed under the stage lights. The engraved metal plate inside the box caught the glare of the flashbulbs. The mayor stepped back, slightly confused but smiling for the cameras. Rachel's voice carried over the quiet ballroom. "To my brilliant grandson, from your real mom, Victoria, who came all the way from Colorado to support your dreams." Victoria stood up and offered a teary, practiced smile to the crowd. Mr. Sinclair nodded approvingly. It was a perfect corporate family portrait. Declan stood at the podium. He looked down at the velvet box. He looked at Rachel's desperate, tight smile. He looked at Victoria playing the grieving, proud mother for her investor. Then, he reached out and pulled the microphone an inch closer to his mouth. "No thank you," Declan said. His voice echoed through the PA system, bouncing off the high-vaulted ceilings of the town hall. He didn't yell. He didn't swat the box away. He just looked at Rachel with complete, freezing indifference. Rachel froze. Her arms were still extended, the green velvet box hovering over the edge of the stage. The mayor coughed nervously into his fist and took a half-step backward. In the front row, Mr. Sinclair's polite, corporate smile vanished. He sat up straighter, sensing a shift in the room's liability. Declan gripped the edges of the acrylic podium. He looked past Rachel, past Victoria, and directly into the crowd of 400 local business owners, council members, and reporters. "Some people believe that a $300,000 secret trust fund automatically buys you the title of a mother," Declan said. His voice was remarkably steady. "They believe that if you hide a financial settlement for 19 years, you can show up at the finish line with a shiny watch and claim the credit." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. The clinking of silverware stopped completely. The only sound was the low electric hum of the stage lights. Victoria's face drained of all color. She grabbed the edge of the linen-covered table. "Declan, sweetheart, stop," she hissed, her voice a desperate, ragged whisper that the front row could easily hear. "You don't understand the legalities." "I understand the math," Declan said into the microphone, cutting her off effortlessly. "I understand that when I was 8 years old, a single albuterol inhaler cost $168.40. I understand that my real mother didn't buy me an engraved luxury watch. She bought that medicine. She bought it by skipping meals for weeks. She bought it by working double shifts drawing architectural blueprints until 3 a.m., giving up her own university degree to keep me breathing. I sat at table 14, my hands gripping the edge of my seat. I couldn't breathe. I was watching my son dismantle 19 years of carefully constructed lies with the surgical precision of an architect tearing down a condemned building. Declan looked directly at Victoria. "You didn't come here tonight to celebrate my scholarship. You came here because I turned 19 in 4 weeks, and you need to look like a devoted parent to your investor before your startup goes bankrupt." In the front row, Mr. Sinclair slowly placed his crystal water glass down on the table. He didn't look angry. He looked analytical. He turned his head slowly and looked at Victoria. "Aaron, he's just confused," Victoria stammered, reaching for Sinclair's sleeve. "It's the trauma talking. My sister poisoned him against me." Sinclair pulled his arm out of her reach. He didn't say a word. He just pulled his smartphone out of his inner pocket and began typing an email, effectively severing his ties to her right there at the table. Rachel was still standing by the stage, her hands shaking so badly that the lid of the velvet box snapped shut. "You are ruining everything," she cried out, abandoning the microphone and yelling directly at Declan. "After everything I did to keep a roof over our heads, you kept a roof over your bakery." A new voice cut through the chaos. It wasn't Declan. It wasn't me. Aunt Evelyn stood up from table 6. She buttoned her tweed jacket with terrifying calmness. The room parted slightly around her. She didn't need a microphone. She had spent 3 decades commanding courtrooms. "As a retired judge of the Warren County Family Court," Evelyn announced, her voice slicing through the heavy silence of the ballroom, "I think it is time to clarify the legal reality of this situation." She pulled a folded, blue-stamped legal document from her clutch purse. 4 days ago," Evelyn continued, walking deliberately toward the front of the room, "an emergency injunction was filed with the probate court. The $300,000 trust established by the Barnes family has been entirely frozen." Victoria let out a sharp, breathless sound, like she had just been punched in the stomach. "Furthermore," Evelyn said, stopping right next to Victoria's table and looking down at her, "tonight at midnight, Declan Sutton turns 19. By legal statute and my filed emergency petition, full control of that principal amount will bypass you completely, Victoria. It will transfer directly into the sole control of the only legally documented guardian this boy has ever had. Megan Sutton, Mr. Sinclair pressed the send icon on his smartphone. The soft digital swoosh of the outgoing email sounded unusually loud in the dead quiet of the ballroom. He stood up slowly and buttoned his charcoal suit jacket. "The term sheet is void, Victoria," Sinclair said. He didn't yell. He used the calm, flat voice of a man cutting his losses. "My assistant will cancel my flight back with you. Do not contact my office again." He didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked down the center aisle, his expensive leather shoes clicking evenly against the hardwood floor. He walked right out the double doors of the town hall, taking Victoria's last $125,000 lifeline with him. Victoria watched the doors swing shut. The rigid, glossy posture she had maintained for 19 years finally snapped. Her knees gave out. She collapsed right there beside table 2, her emerald dress bunching up on the ugly patterned carpet. She covered her face with both hands, her manicured nails digging into her forehead. She didn't look like a tech CEO. She looked exactly like the terrified teenager who had survived a car crash on Highway 7. "I didn't want any of this," Victoria sobbed. It wasn't a pretty, movie-style cry. It was loud, wet, and ugly. "I just wanted to go to Trent. I was scared. I couldn't look at him." She pointed a shaking finger blindly toward the stage, toward Declan. Rachel panicked. The 400 people in the room, the bank manager who held her mortgage, the vendors who supplied her bakery, the neighbors she had lied to for 2 decades, were all watching her. Her social fortress was collapsing in real time. "Victoria, get up," Rachel hissed, grabbing her daughter's shoulder and trying to haul her to her feet. "Stop making a scene. Mayor Hopkins, please, this is a private family misunderstanding." Rachel's hands were shaking so violently that she lost her grip on the green velvet box. It slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a dull thud. The heavy silver watch spilled out, sliding across the carpet until it stopped near the ice sculpture. Nobody moved to pick it up. On the stage, Declan watched them. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked at the 2 women on the floor, surrounded by broken lies and a useless luxury watch, and he just looked sad for them. They had traded a family for a trust fund, and in the end they had lost both. Declan turned away from the microphone. He walked down the 4 wooden steps of the stage. The reporters didn't flash their cameras. The crowd stayed perfectly silent, watching the 19-year-old boy in the rented black suit walk down the center aisle. He ignored the mayor. He ignored Rachel's frantic excuses. He walked straight back to table 14. He stopped right in front of my chair. I looked up at him. His jaw was set, but his eyes were entirely soft. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out the heavy, scratched silver compass with the cracked glass. He held it in his hand for a second, feeling the weight of it, feeling the history of a father he never knew and a tragedy that almost ruined him. Then, he reached out and gently placed the compass directly into the center of my palm. He folded my fingers over the cold metal. "My father's last token always showed me the right path," Declan said. His voice was a quiet murmur, meant only for me. "But it didn't need to, because my path is only you, Mom." I held the cracked silver compass in my fist. I thought about the $21.50 an hour drafting job. I thought about the cold basement, the $168 asthma inhalers, and the nights I stayed awake listening to him breathe. I looked at the incredible, strong young man standing in front of me, and I knew every single second of the last 19 years had been worth it. I stood up. I picked up my plain black purse from the back of the chair. "Let's go home, Declan," I said. We did not run. We didn't hurry. We walked down the center aisle of the ballroom at an even, steady pace. The crowd of local politicians, wealthy developers, and reporters parted for us in complete silence. Nobody tried to stop us. Not a single person asked a question. As we reached the heavy oak double doors of the town hall, I pushed them open, and the cool June night air hit my face. It smelled like damp asphalt and impending rain. It was the best thing I had ever smelled. Aunt Evelyn stepped out into the night air just a few seconds behind us. She didn't offer a dramatic speech or a hug. She simply adjusted the collar of her tweed jacket, looked at Declan, and gave him a single respectful nod. "Happy early birthday, Declan," she said quietly. "I will call the bank manager at 9:30 a.m. tomorrow to finalize the transfer papers. Have a good night, Megan." She walked toward her sedan. Declan and I walked toward my old taped-up Toyota. When we got inside the car, Declan didn't turn on the radio. He reached up, pulled the knot of his rented black tie loose, and let out a long, slow breath. It wasn't an asthma wheeze. It was the sound of a massive, crushing weight finally rolling off his chest. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, caught, and hummed to life. We drove through the quiet streets of Maple Ridge. We passed the 24-hour pharmacy on 5th Street, the exact same pharmacy where I used to stand at the counter at 4 in the morning, counting crumpled $1 bills to see if I had enough for his nebulizer solution. We passed the local drafting firm where Mr. Harrison had given me a lifeline of $28 an hour. Every street corner held a memory of a sacrifice, but tonight, none of them felt heavy. They just felt like the foundation of a building that was finally finished. We pulled into our cracked driveway. The house was completely dark. Rachel was not home. She was likely still at the town hall, trying to sweep up the shattered pieces of her social standing, or perhaps dealing with Victoria's breakdown in the lobby. I didn't know, and for the first time in my life, I realized it was not my job to fix it. We went inside. The house was incredibly quiet. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Declan didn't go to his room. He walked straight down the stairs to the basement. I followed him. He walked over to my old battered drafting desk, the one where I had taught him how to draw a load-bearing wall when he was 8. He placed the heavy silver compass gently on the corner of the desk. Beside it, he placed the thick embossed envelope containing the $20,000 mayor's scholarship. He pulled out the wooden drafting stool, sat down, and picked up a fresh graphite pencil. I leaned against the doorframe, watching him. "What are you doing, buddy? It's past 11. You should sleep." "I have an idea for a roofline modification on the community center," Declan said, tracing a faint, perfectly straight line across a sheet of vellum. He didn't look up, but a small, genuine smile touched the corners of his mouth. "And I don't feel like sleeping." I walked over to the small basement window. I looked out at the streetlights casting long shadows across our front lawn. I looked at the digital clock on the desk. The red numbers flipped with a soft click. 11:59 p.m. I watched the seconds tick by. I thought about the $300,000 trust fund sitting in a locked bank server across town. I thought about the blood on the compass 20 years ago, the terrifying trips to the ER, and the cold cruelty of a mother and sister who would have let us drown just to save their own pride. The red numbers clicked one more time. 12 a.m. It was midnight. Declan was officially 19 years old. There were no fireworks. The bank didn't call. The earth didn't shake. But somewhere in a digital ledger, an emergency injunction expired, and a frozen account shifted. The money that was meant for his safety, the money that had been hidden and stolen and lied about, was finally his. Legally, completely, and permanently. He was safe. We were safe. "Mom?" Declan asked, his pencil pausing on the paper. I turned away from the window and looked at the brilliant, resilient young man sitting at the drafting table. "Yeah, Declan? Can you check the structural load on this archway? I think my math is off by a fraction." I walked over, pulled up a second chair and sat down beside him. "Let me see." We spent the next 3 hours going over the structural load of that archway. By 3:30 a.m., the math was perfect. Declan finally fell asleep right there, his head resting on his crossed arms over the drafting vellum. I didn't wake him. I just draped a heavy fleece blanket over his shoulders and sat in the quiet basement, listening to the steady, clear sound of his breathing. At 9 o'clock the next morning, we walked into the Premier Trust Bank on Broad Street. Aunt Evelyn was already waiting in the lobby. She had a thick manila folder tucked under her arm and a thermos of black tea in her hand. She gave Declan a brief nod and led us straight back to the branch manager's office. Mr. Gallagher was a man who had denied my application for a $2,500 used car loan 7 years ago. He used to look at my scuffed shoes and my $1.21 an hour pay stubs with polite pity. Today he stood up so fast he knocked his expensive fountain pen off his mahogany desk. "Miss Sutton, Declan, please, sit down," he said, gesturing to the plush leather chairs. His tone was coated in a thick, newly discovered respect. Evelyn placed the manila folder on the desk. "The probate injunction expired at midnight, David. Declan is 19. The Barnes family trust principal is now fully vested. You will transfer the entire balance to a new dual-signature account under Megan and Declan's names immediately." Mr. Gallagher typed rapidly on his keyboard. The computer screen reflected in his glasses. "Of course, Judge. The transfer is processing now. The total liquid principal, after the frozen allowance returns are factored in, is $305,214.60. I sat in the leather chair and stared at the brass nameplate on Gallagher's desk. $305,000. I thought about the winter days I walked to work in the freezing rain because I couldn't afford a new alternator for the Toyota. I thought about the panic attacks in the pharmacy line, praying my debit card wouldn't decline for a $168 inhaler. That money had been sitting in this exact building the entire time. Rachel had driven past this bank every single day on her way to her bakery, knowing full well we were drowning. "We need a cashier's check for $3,000, I said. My voice didn't shake. "For a security deposit on a new apartment. And I need the daily withdrawal limit lifted on the debit cards." Declan looked at me. He smiled. By 11:10 a.m., the check was tucked safely inside my purse. We drove back to the house to pack. When we walked through the front door, the house felt entirely different. It felt like a museum of a family that didn't exist anymore. Rachel was sitting at the kitchen table. She was still wearing the silk slip from under her gala dress. Her makeup was smudged, deeply settled into the lines around her eyes. A cold cup of black coffee sat in front of her. She looked up when we walked into the kitchen. The arrogance was completely gone. She looked small. She looked old. "Victoria left," Rachel said, her voice hollow. "She took an Uber to the airport at 7 this morning. She didn't even say goodbye, Mr. Sinclair's lawyers are already emailing her about fraud." I didn't reply. I walked past the table, opened the pantry door, and pulled out a stack of flattened cardboard boxes I had brought home from the drafting firm weeks ago. I handed 3 to Declan. "What are you doing?" Rachel asked, watching the cardboard unfold. "We are packing," I said, taping the bottom of a box with a loud tearing sound. Rachel stood up. Her chair scraped harshly against the linoleum. "You can't leave, Megan. The bank manager called me an hour ago. The commercial loan for the bakery is tied to the house equity. Without the trust allowance, they are going to foreclose by the end of the month. I will lose the business. I will lose this house." She wasn't yelling. She was begging. The woman who had told me to figure it out when my son's lips were turning blue was now asking me to save her. "You have over $300,000 now," Rachel said, her voice cracking as tears finally spilled over her eyelashes. "You are my daughter. You can't just let me lose everything." I put the roll of packing tape down on the granite counter. I looked at the woman who had handed me a newborn baby, a crushing ultimatum, and a life of poverty when I was 23 years old, all to protect her own reputation. "Mom," I said, my voice completely calm, echoing the exact words she had used on me for 19 years. "Things are very tight right now. You're smart though. Figure it out." I picked up the tape, handed Declan his empty box, and walked downstairs to the basement. The wooden stairs creaked under my feet as I walked down to the basement. The air was cool, smelling heavily of damp concrete and graphite dust. Declan was already unfolding the flaps of his cardboard box. He didn't ask what I had said to Rachel. He didn't need to. We packed quietly. I gathered my old scale rulers, the taped-up T-square, and the rolls of drafting vellum. I placed them into the box, feeling the familiar worn edges of the tools that had kept us alive. Declan crouched in the corner of the room. He pulled a heavy gray plastic case out from under his bed. It was the nebulizer machine. The plastic tubing was coiled neatly inside. He held the handle, looking at the machine that used to dictate our entire lives, the machine that hummed through the darkest, most terrifying nights of his childhood. He looked up at me. "Do we pack it?" I looked at the gray plastic box. Then I looked at my son, standing tall, his lungs clear, his future entirely his own. "No," I said quietly. "Leave it right there. We don't need it anymore." He nodded, pushed the case back into the corner, and went back to packing his books. It took us 4 trips to carry our boxes up the stairs and out the front door. We walked through the kitchen each time. Rachel never moved. She sat at the table with her hands folded over her cold cup of coffee, staring at the floral wallpaper. She was trapped in a house she was about to lose, surrounded by the consequences of 19 years of greed. We didn't yell. We didn't demand apologies. We just carried our boxes right past her. The silence we left behind was the heaviest thing in that house. I set the final box into the trunk of my old Toyota and pushed the lid down. It slammed shut with a sharp, heavy metal clank. It sounded like a vault locking. We drove across town. The afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds, casting bright, warm light across the streets of Maple Ridge. We parked in front of a brick duplex on Oak Street, just 3 blocks away from Aunt Evelyn's house and Mr. Harrison's drafting firm. I unlocked the front door with the shiny brass key the landlord had given me an hour ago. We walked inside. The apartment was completely empty. The hardwood floors were spotless. The walls were painted a clean, bright white. There was no rattling furnace, no damp smell, no shadows of debt hanging over the ceiling. It was just an empty space, waiting to be built upon. Our footsteps echoed softly as we walked into the center of the living room. Large windows looked out over a small green front lawn. Declan set his box down on the floor. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs completely, effortlessly. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out the heavy, scratched silver compass. He walked over to the large living room window. He didn't put it in his pocket this time. He set it gently on the wooden windowsill, right in the center of the warm sunlight. The cracked glass caught the light, shining brightly. "It's a good foundation," Declan said, looking out the window. I walked over and stood shoulder to shoulder with him. I looked at the compass, and then I looked at the young man who had designed a building to help other kids breathe, a boy who had refused to let a price tag dictate the value of a mother. Biology is just an accident of birth. Love is the choice you make when the hospital triage nurse calls at 4:15 in the morning. Love is the $21 drafting job, the skipped meals, and the courage to finally walk out the door. "Yes, it is," I said, putting my arm around his shoulder. "It's a perfect foundation. If you have ever been the quiet foundation for someone else's life, if you have built a home out of nothing but sheer grit, sacrifice, and unconditional love while others took the credit, then you know exactly how this sunlight feels. You know what it takes to survive the storm and finally walk into a room of your own." Take a moment to gently hit the like button, subscribe, and share this space with me, because quiet journeys like this are truly understood only by the resilient hearts who have lived them.